For a time in the 1930s, it seemed to many of us that we no longer knew what country we lived in. Soldiers were fighting war veterans on the streets of Washington. Some Americans were joining the Communist Party, which was taking its cue from Moscow. Others, the German-American Bund, which supported Adolf Hitler. Then there was a charismatic young senator from Louisiana named Huey Pierce Long. Behind his homegrown ways and extravagant promises for the country's poor, many saw a budding American dictator. Long's career would be ended by an assassin's bullet. The other conflicts would be eclipsed by the coming of a Second World War. Let's lift the veil now on this disturbing and dangerous time in our nation's history when revolution, if not outright civil war, seemed only a breath away. In desperate times came desperate measures. Thousands of hungry, forgotten war veterans marching on Washington, and a beleaguered government responding with deadly force. Tanks rolling on Pennsylvania Avenue. Sons taking up arms against their fathers. Heroes of a past war against those of a future war.
It was the last cavalry charge. Imagine John Wayne charging his own former comrades. That's what it was like.
While the bonus army marched on Washington, other Americans looked for answers from Moscow. And from a man who many said was a homegrown version of Hitler or Mussolini, Huey Long.
He was the demon of the privileged classes, the established classes, mainstream politicians, the nightmare of wealthy Americans.
And God knows what he would have done to the country. I'd have been willing to shoot him myself, I guess.
From America's class wars to the brink of the next shooting war, one that would finally spell the end of the Great Depression. They had toiled and triumphed on the killing fields of Europe. But the ticker tape that showered them with glory in 1918 had beggared them in 1929. The forgotten men, they were called, blending into the gray millions who were looking for a job or a handout. But unlike other Americans, war veterans had a safety net, a bonus it was called, that amounted to about $1,000 a man, payable in 1945.
No, when I get this money, I'm going to have my teeth fixed and my wife's teeth because they're just as bad as mine, and I'm going to buy some clothes for my kid.
Problem was, they needed that money in 1930, not 1945. It was like walking around with a check in your pocket that you couldn't cash for 15 years. In 1930, a bill was proposed that allowed for immediate payments of the bonuses. But President Hoover opposed it, believing that early payouts would bankrupt his treasury. The bill went nowhere. Nowhere, that is, until the boys from Oregon hijacked a freight train. On May 11th, 1932, 300 veterans blocked the tracks outside Portland, Oregon. When the train stopped, they boarded it. It was eastbound toward Washington, where the veterans intended to force passage of the bonus bill. At first, the bonus army was little more than a disorganized mob, until they reached a rail yard outside Pocatello, Idaho, where a man named Walter Waters took command.
He climbed a boxcar and made a stirring speech to the discouraged and disgruntled veterans, telling them that they must take pride in the fact that they had served their country, that being a soldier was the greatest event of their lives, that they had earned that bonus, that that was not a handout, but something that they had earned and deserved.
Under the military-style discipline imposed by Waters, the veterans resumed their odyssey. Along the way, the improbable little army started getting noticed. In the midst of the Depression, it was a story that hit home.
Now, by the time they got to East St. Louis, newspaper reporters just loved this story. This had all sorts of human interest, and everybody was interested in this.
The forgotten men were forgotten no longer, and when other veterans got the word, they also took up the flag. Donning their old Army khakis and starting off for Washington. More often than not, they were sent off with a solemn parade down Main Street and donations tossed into a canvas. By the time Waters arrived in Washington, his original contingent of 300 had multiplied several times. Even more veterans arrived in the next weeks, some with their wives and children. Soon, as many as 25,000 veterans and their family members occupied the Capitol, the largest demonstration to date in American history.
The only really spontaneous march, and it's been imitated ever since, and each one of those imitations has had their own value. But this one was, this was the authentic one. This is the real one. This is the one that started it all.
With the military posturings of the bonus army, Washington seemed under siege. But the man charged with keeping order in the district was not intimidated. Police Superintendent Pelham D. Glassford had been down this road before. In December 1931, the American Communist Party had marched on Washington. On that occasion, Glassford had avoided violence with a policy of non-confrontation. Instead of harassing the demonstrators, he had provided them with rations and campsites. He had even led the Communist parade down Pennsylvania Avenue on his motorcycle, as they sang of hanging President Hoover from a sour apple tree. Their venom spent and their bellies full, the Reds went home. Now Glassford tried the same tactics with the bonus marchers, issuing rations and Army surplus tents, playing the time-honored role of the good cop.
He liked these men, and he telegraphed that to them. They knew he liked them. And he wasn't just your average police chief. He was somebody who sympathized with them, who identified with them, who'd been in the trenches with them. He loved them.
Still, Glassford would become one of the many prominent and well-meaning men whose reputation would be destroyed in the coming weeks. The bonus army's occupation of Washington started off peacefully enough. On the mud flats beside the Anacostia River, Waters' men settled into an army-style bivouac. To keep order, Waters had his own military police, who were also used to beat up the communists who tried to infiltrate the camps. Other veterans, wanting a real roof over their heads, settled into some abandoned federal buildings along Pennsylvania Avenue. But down the street from the shanty towns, on the other side of the immaculate lawns and rose trestles, there was no peace. President Hoover privately supported the accommodating Glassford, but he rigidly opposed the bonus bill, promising a veto if it ever reached his desk. Nonetheless, the bill easily passed in the House, reaching the Senate on the last day of Congress 1932. That morning, Waters and his bonus army seized the Capitol steps. Despite the show of force, the Senate defeated the bonus bill by a vote of 62 to 18. At least one senator deeply regretted the result. "This marks a new era in the life of our nation," said Senator Hiram Johnson of California. "The time may come when this falderall, these trappings of government, will disappear, when fat old men like you and me will be lined up against a stone wall." But among the massed veterans on the Senate steps, there wasn't the rioting that many had feared.
When the Senate refused to consider the bonus, that crowd out there on the Capitol steps that everyone was worried about sang America.
The patriotic hymn sounded like a dirge in their disheartened voices. Walter Waters declared that his men would stay until 1945 unless they got their bonus checks first.
"I am not advising anybody to go home. We intend to maintain our army in Washington regardless of who goes home."
But the president's patience was at an end. Hoover instructed the Treasury Department to begin issuing eviction orders. First to go would be the squatters in the old federal buildings. When Glassford's police and Treasury agents entered one building, some veterans threw bricks and bottles. Glassford was forced to the ground and his badge ripped off. 3 policemen were badly beaten. In another building, a policeman panicked when attacked by veterans.
He drew his revolver and shot through the heart one of the veterans and fatally wounded another, and began firing wildly at veterans who were attacking him.
Within minutes of the shooting, Army troops were assembling on the ellipse behind the White House. General Douglas MacArthur had been urging the use of troops, but Hoover hesitated. The notion of the United States Army marching on American war veterans was a hateful one. Hoover told MacArthur that he would authorize it only on one condition: that he receive a written statement from Police Chief Glassford that the situation was out of control and that troops were necessary. In fact, Glassford never issued such a statement, but he was quoted as doing so in a report to Hoover from the Secretary of War, Patrick Hurley.
And so without consulting Glassford, they put it in writing to Hoover that they had consulted Glassford and that Glassford agreed that federal troops were absolutely essential.
Taking Hurley at his word, Hoover finally gave a cautiously worded order. "Surround the affected area and clear it without delay," said the president. "Turn over all prisoners to the civil authorities. Use all humanity consistent with the due execution of the order." In defiance of the order, Army tanks would soon roll through clouds of tear gas down Pennsylvania Avenue. General MacArthur was about to take the president's caution and throw it to the winds. On a steamy July afternoon in 1932, battle lines were drawn in Washington, D.C. On one side were 15,000 diehards from the Bonus March. To all appearances, they were on the verge of a mass riot. Bristling with guns and armor, the United States Army was gathering to meet the threat. President Hoover had tried to mediate the crisis by limiting the Army's powers. They were to be used as a glorified police force. But Douglas MacArthur had more, far more in mind for this operation, soon to be called the Battle of Washington. General Douglas MacArthur had taken the Great Depression personally. He had the position he had always coveted, Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces. But the top job was his in the worst of times. There was the relentless belt-tightening of the Depression, and a wave of peace treaties, including the 1929 Geneva Convention, which created a pacifist mood in Washington. With the current crisis, MacArthur felt his hour had finally come.
It certainly appears that he saw an opportunity to use the Army in a dramatic way so that he could present to the Congress and to the American people the need for a strong Army.
Now MacArthur assumed personal command of the troops.
And he said of himself that MacArthur is taking the field to Eisenhower.
Future Allied commander and President Dwight Eisenhower was then one of MacArthur's aides.
Eisenhower said to MacArthur that for the Chief of Staff of the American Army to involve himself in a possible riot was demeaning to the Chief of Staff. It was demeaning to the Army.
MacArthur ignored the young officer's counsel and gave the orders to march. Rumors had attracted a large crowd of reporters and onlookers to Pennsylvania Avenue. Some of them cheered at the sight of the United States cavalry in their immaculately dressed rows. Next came the infantry, commanded by then Major George S. Patton. Patton's troops entered the old Federal Army building, now occupied by squatters, only to be saluted by a shower of bricks and bottles. Both foot soldier and horse soldier struck back.
The last cavalry charge. A horrible irony in a way, the last cavalry charge of the American cavalry was to trample down men who had served with the very men who were trampling them down.
There were no more cheers for MacArthur's army. Using tear gas and bayonets, the troops soon cleared out the condemned buildings. MacArthur advanced further down Pennsylvania Avenue. 6 miniature tanks brought up the rear. They didn't fire a single shot, yet the tanks were a devastating sight to those who had seen them used in earnest during the Great War. The Army proceeded to Anacostia Bridge, where MacArthur halted to rest and feed his troops. President Hoover, closely monitoring the action, was increasingly concerned. He tried to intervene, twice sending new sets of orders to MacArthur. Both times he forbade the Army from crossing the Anacostia River to the campsites on the other side. But both times the Chief of Staff ignored the orders.
At some point, MacArthur was supposed to have said he didn't want officers coming down pretending to bring him orders.
At 9 o'clock, MacArthur made his move into Anacostia. Bayonets pushed the ragged veterans back. Their shanties were given the torch. In minutes, the night was ablaze. The bonus city would burn until it was no more. And 15,000 men, women, and children of the bonus army had been driven homeless into the night. The so-called Battle of Washington was over. But for Douglas MacArthur, the real battle was about to begin, with the press and with a president who felt that he had been callously betrayed. The next morning, MacArthur and Secretary of War Hurley were summoned to Hoover's office.
He should have demanded that MacArthur and Hurley immediately tell the press of the orders that he had repeatedly sent to them not to attack the Anacostia camp. That's exactly what he should have done, and he should have done it immediately. And if they had refused, which they later would do, he should have fired them right there on the spot.
The angry president gave his officers a tongue lashing, but he did not ask for their jobs. The rout of the bonus army was an accomplished fact, and Hoover tried to put a good face on it.
And Hurley and MacArthur thought it over and refused. And they said to Hoover, the press is with us. 99% of the press is with us. Only a few scatterbrains are opposing us. You should stand at the head and take the credit. We could make ourselves heroes by doing this.
The tide of public opinion soon turned against the president. An investigation revealed, among other things, that Police Superintendent Glassford had never been properly consulted on the use of troops. Now Glassford, instead of blaming MacArthur, blamed President Hoover. Subsequently, Glassford fell out with his own police force, who had wanted the Army's intervention all along. In October, he was forced out of his job. President Hoover, who had covered up for MacArthur, found himself accountable for the fiasco. It was another torpedo in his rapidly sinking presidency.
He now appears to be a cold-hearted, villainous president who would use force against women and children and the heroes of World War I.
By 1933, the bonuses were another president's headache. But this actually was one issue on which Roosevelt sided with Hoover.
He vetoed the bill 3 times, the bonus bill 3 times. It was only after the 3rd time that the bill passed.
Finally, in 1936, the veterans groups won over Congress. The bonuses were paid in full. One last victory for the heroes of the Great War.
Have you heard the latest news? These veterans ain't got no more blues. They are planning just what to do since that bonus done gone through.
Douglas MacArthur had also taken flack for his use of troops against the bonus marches. But by deflecting the responsibility onto President Hoover, he had saved his own career.
Now MacArthur lied. He lied to Glassford, and MacArthur will consistently lie for the rest of his life, arguing that he was merely obeying the president's orders.
President Roosevelt was also leery of the Chief of Staff. He would call MacArthur one of the 2 most dangerous men in America. To Roosevelt, the other most dangerous man was Huey Long. The senator from Louisiana would take up where the bonus march left off, leading a popular uprising against the ruling classes in Depression-era America.
The Lord has answered the prayer. He has called the barbecue. Come to my feast. He said to 125 million American people. But
by 1935, all of America was talking about Huey Long. If you were a sharecropper or factory hand, he probably looked like a savior.
And the masses of America.
If you were an oil company executive or plantation owner, he was your mortal enemy, and you probably entertained ideas about shooting the SOB. If you were Franklin Roosevelt, you saw a young man who was arrogant enough to want your job, and maybe smart enough that he just might get it. As the man who was called the Kingfish seized the national spotlight, a great many people were asking, which is the real Huey Long? As governor of Louisiana, Long had undeniably improved the state's infrastructure. He opened up remote areas by paving thousands of miles of dirt roads, raising bridges over previously impassable rivers and bayous. He distributed free textbooks to school children, and when the Depression came, he eliminated some property taxes so that poor people would avoid foreclosures.
Louisiana didn't really know what a depression was. They didn't know they had a depression and wouldn't have known they had a depression if they weren't a part of the United States, because it's the United States that had the depression, not Louisiana.
How he financed all this public-spirited work, however, was cause for alarm. He raised taxes mercilessly on big business. In particular, he targeted the oil companies and the cotton barons. Many contemptuously called the old regulars. Long went after them with a dictatorial vengeance. The old regulars, he said,
are being told what they can do and what they can't do, what they will pay, what they can't keep from paying.
Long did tremendous damage to the democratic quality of life in Louisiana politics. He eroded many of the institutions of democratic governance. He discredited some of the positions that he himself held because of the tactics he used to advance them.
It was Huey Long who brought mobster Frank Costello to New Orleans. When Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia kicked Costello out of New York, Long welcomed him and his slot machines with open arms. Reports had it that the governor was getting kickbacks from the gangster. Long's followers turned a blind eye. In Louisiana and elsewhere, there had always been abuses in government. They had just always been on the rich man's side. This time, the poor man was in the winner's corner, and their champion was putting on quite a show. After one senator opposed him on his plan to build a new state capital, Long had a hole drilled over the man's desk. Every time it rained, water would gush onto the senator's head. The plans were soon approved, and Long built the tallest state capitol in the nation, some say as a monument to himself. When legislators refused to tear down the old governor's mansion, Long gathered a crew of convicts from the state prison and supervised the demolition himself. He later remarked that the old governor's mansion was not good enough for him, but that it had been too good for his predecessors.
I have promised to give some instructions on medicine to the doctors of the United States this afternoon.
Long even poked fun at himself. He adopted the nickname the Kingfish after a pompous character on the Amos and Andy radio show. His fans loved it, and so did his enemies. The name stuck. There was only one threat to the Kingfish's power in Louisiana. In 1929, legislators tried to impeach him on charges of gross corruption.
I was elected railroad commissioner of Louisiana in 1918, and they tried to impeach me in 1920. When they failed to impeach me in 1920, they indicted me in 1921. And when I wiggled through that, I managed to become governor in 1928. And they impeached me in 1929.
And he basically escaped impeachment the way he did everything else, by a combination of bribing and bullying.
The Kingfish emerged more powerful and arrogant than ever. I used to try to get things done by saying please, he said. That didn't work, and now I'm a dynamiter. I just dynamite them out of my path. In 1932, Long was elected to the United States Senate, but his stranglehold on Louisiana was still secure. A boyhood friend of Long's, Oscar K. Allen, was installed in the governor's mansion. Allen was quickly dubbed O.K. Allen for his slavish devotion to Long. O.K. Allen was said to be so compliant that he once signed a leaf that blew onto his desk. In Washington, Senator Long instantly attracted attention, as much for his outlandish clothes as for his politics. He favored bright pastel shirts and loud ties, and often he conducted official business in colorful silk pajamas. While he scandalized the establishment, his fame only grew.
In the United States Senate, when other people were giving speeches, he was striding around the room, slapping people in the back, talking loudly, making snide comments about what other people were saying.
Then came a falling out with FDR. Long had once campaigned tirelessly for Roosevelt, but now he began lashing out at the president.
Roosevelt on the one hand and Hoover on the other, the twin bed mates of disaster. We want neither one of them, and we've got to have a candidate away from the Republican Party and away from the Democratic Party. I, for one, am perfectly willing to see that there's another choice in the United States in 1936.
The message was unmistakable. Huey Pierce Long and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were no longer allies, they were rivals. By 1935, weaknesses had begun to show in the Roosevelt armor. The nation remained locked in the Depression. Some New Deal programs, such as the National Recovery Administration, had been thrown out by the Supreme Court. Other proposals didn't seem to go far enough to help the poor. But nobody could accuse Huey Long of halfway measures.
Every man a king, every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. That's fine.
Long's Share the Wealth program guaranteed a yearly income for every American and a car in every garage. Who would foot the bill? People like the J.P. Morgans, the Rockefellers, and the Roosevelts. Every man a king, Huey said, but no one wears a crown. In 1935, Huey Long was supremely confident that he was destined for the White House. Running on a third-party ticket in 1936, Long felt he could split the vote with Roosevelt and ensure a Republican victory. And then Long believed he could easily whip any Republican in 1940. In any event, he had time on his side. In 1940, he would be only 46 years old. In the meantime, he continued to run Louisiana from Washington, compiling a long list of enemies.
It's certainly clear that talk of killing Huey Long was a very common activity in the elegant drawing rooms and dining rooms of New Orleans in the mid-1930s.
And God knows what he would have done to the country. I'd have been willing to shoot him myself, I guess.
By September of 1935, Long was back in Baton Rouge, stirring up the political gumbo. One of his projects was getting rid of Judge Benjamin Pavey. Though a bitter enemy of Long's, Pavey had been entrenched in his parish for 30 years. The Kingfish now proposed to redraw the election district, gerrymandering the judge out of his job. As usual, Long was darting from the House to the Senate, dictating legislation, barking orders, talking up the press. As always, he was one step ahead of his bodyguards. When Carl Austin Weiss stepped out of the crowd, he had a clear shot. His bodyguards arrived a moment later and began shooting wildly. They killed Weiss, who was the son-in-law of Long's enemy, Judge Pavey. Some believe that it was not Weiss who killed the Kingfish, but a stray bullet from the melee. The bullet holes now mark the walls of Long's beloved capital. Long lived for 24 hours after the fatal shot. As he slipped away, he kept repeating, "But I have so much left to do." From the elegant drawing rooms of Louisiana to those of Washington, D.C., there was a collective sigh of relief.
Roosevelt was very, very concerned about Long, and not the least unhappy when he got shot.
But for many Americans, their champion was gone. Poor people had been cheated again, this time by an assassin's bullet. Huey Long was just 42 when he was laid to rest in the swampy soil of Louisiana. He remains one of the enigmas of American politics, not so much for who he was, but for what America might have been if he had lived.
We expect to see the 48 states of America and the United States fall in line with Louisiana's Share Our Wealth program. That would mean that there'll be no such thing as a man without a home and something to eat and something to wear and a job.
Huey Long had a vision of a homegrown utopia that would pull the country out of the Depression. Other Americans saw a utopia too, this one thriving 5,000 miles away. By all accounts, the Soviet Union was depression-proof, and American communists had not yet realized the horrors that lay beneath the facade of the workers' paradise. The siren call of communism was never stronger in America than it was during the 1930s. The hammer and sickle had an obvious appeal. While America struggled through the worst depression in history, things had never been better in Russia. That is, if you believed the propaganda.
And today it is above all the granary of Eastern Europe, with the black earth bringing forth millions of acres of wheat.
More than party hacks were flattering the Reds. Some of the foremost thinkers of the day were talking about Russia in glowing, even reckless terms. "I have seen the future and it works," said crusading journalist Lincoln Steffens. Writer Edmund Wilson wrote, "I felt as though I was in a moral sanctuary where the light never stopped shining."
Paul Robeson sent his son to be brought up and educated in the Soviet Union because he felt that in the Soviet Union, his son would be treated without the kind of discrimination that he would face in the United States.
Few people moved to Moscow, but many joined their local branch of the American Communist Party. American communists tended to be different from the Soviet variety. While Russians were pragmatic, Americans were often passionate idealists. Like Tilly Olson, whose meeting with a California migrant worker was a moment of revelation.
The mother says, "We go hungry. Our children are hungry." She says, "But I am hungry for much more than food," she says. "I am hungry for a different world. I'm hungry for when all children will have enough to eat and will go to school and will be able to sing and laugh and play."
Communists served as the shock troops of the labor unions. Workers were often afraid to organize for fear of losing their jobs, but the Reds, who had little to lose, would fearlessly jump into any labor battle. The uproar caused by the communists was out of proportion to their real numbers. Membership in the American Communist Party reached an all-time high in 1935. It was barely 75,000, enough to fill Madison Square Garden, but not enough to make a dent in national politics. This was just about the time the disturbing reports began to come in from the Soviet Union. It seemed all was not well in the workers' paradise. Stalin was sending his political enemies to the Gulag concentration camps or to firing squads. His vicious economic policies were condemning millions of others to death by starvation. American party leaders dismissed these reports as right-wing propaganda. Instead, they focused their attention on communism's staunchest foe, fascism. In the mid-1930s, the rise of fascism became the biggest threat to communism, an even bigger enemy than capitalism itself.
The communists reconsidered their aims. Are their aims to overthrow capitalism, to be a revolutionary party, or are their aims to stop fascism? Because it didn't seem that they could do both.
The fight became more urgent as fascist armies stormed across the borders of their weaker neighbors. Mussolini invaded and conquered Ethiopia in 1935. Hitler and Mussolini began supplying arms to the fascist side in the Spanish Civil War. While Hitler sent guns and bombers, communists sent men, hundreds of soldiers willing to risk their lives for their beliefs. The costs were high. Half the soldiers in the American Brigade were killed in action, and only for a losing cause. Franco's troops took power in the spring of 1939. Back in America, communists did what they did best. They raised a stink. It was a time when most Americans were on the side of non-intervention in Europe. The Reds were helping to sound the alarm against Hitler. And then the Kremlin did something that had American communists shaking their heads in disbelief. On August 22, 1939, the official Soviet news agency announced that the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, a pledge never to fight Hitler on the battlefield. It was a move of stunning hypocrisy that devastated the American far left. The enemy they had attacked so passionately was now, on paper at least, a friend.
It was a simply untenable position for people who had been urging a united front against fascism.
The American party's bland response mimicked the official Soviet line that the pact was a self-defense measure. But many party members didn't buy it.
And it was catastrophic for the party. People left it in droves. And the respect that the party had built up in many, many areas got dissipated almost immediately.
In New York's Garment District, Jewish communists were greeted with cries of "Heil Hitler" and spat on in the streets. On September 1st, 1939, just 10 days after the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact, it happened. Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, England and France declared war. There was one final shock in store for American communists. 2 weeks after German troops crossed Poland's western frontier, Soviet troops attacked from the east. This act of naked aggression shattered American illusions about the Soviet Union once and for all. The brief, tumultuous heyday of American communism was over. Simultaneously, the economy was finally showing signs of life. The World War was about to accomplish what 10 years of belt-tightening and 7 years of the New Deal could not do on their own. That was to end the Great Depression. The war clouds over Europe were heavily lined with silver. For American factories, it meant an opportunity to amass profits for the production of war materiel. For the labor unions, it meant a sudden abundance of jobs in armories, airplane factories, and shipyards.
I had a job. My family desperately needed for me to get a job. And now I had a steady job. And time and a half. Soon I was working 7 days a week and 10 and 12 hours a day and getting time and a half and sometimes double time. And we had more money at this point than we ever had before.
For Douglas MacArthur, it was vindication for the fiasco of the Bonus March. After a decade of shrinking budgets and peace treaties, the need for a strong army had been graphically proven. For a bone-tired President Roosevelt, it meant a break from Depression economics, and perhaps a window of opportunity for his most secret ambition, as he once hinted to Walter Troen.
Looking at the White House, it's a wonderful thing to be president in wartime. He wanted to be a president in wartime.
But for the guy on the street, it meant that one fear had been replaced with another. Your anxiety about where your next meal was coming from disappeared into the anxiety of imminent war. Your nightmares became newsreels of Stukas dive-bombing your hometown, just like Spain or Poland. And when you woke up with the smell of gunpowder and gas fading from your nostrils, you went out to get the paper, and there, as often as not, was Adolf Hitler. His picture along with a headline about his latest lies, right next to an article about politicians who swore by their mothers that American boys would never again have to fight someone else's fight. Sure. Of course, it was a lot easier now than 10 years back. There were jobs to spare and the icebox was stuffed. For the first time in your life, you had a year-old Chevy instead of a worn-out flivver. New suit, too. You could cut quite a figure with your wife and kids on a Sunday afternoon, like something you'd seen in the movies. Yet all this prosperity made you feel somehow uneasy, as though you were being fattened up for the slaughter. Without a goodbye or a pause for breath, the Great Depression was gone. Not that you'd want it back, but there was something pure and sweet about the way folks spared a dime, shared some coal, or made room for you on a crowded boxcar when you didn't have anything. Nobody else had anything either, and Americans were the closest they've ever been to being free and equal, even if they were down and out. It wasn't that being broke made you a better person, hardly, but it did show you what you were made of. The Great Depression showed Americans their raw souls. We were all poor immigrants again, with an ancient sense of family and dreams that not even hard times could destroy. Look at the poor migrant workers immortalized in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath.
We have to say that they came here for their dreams. They came here to escape a very terrible world, the Dust Bowl world, and they did do that. They became Californians. They integrated themselves into the fabric of the state, and today, of course, to be descended from a Dust Bowl migrant family in California today, 50, 60 years later, is a point of honor.
And in those days, around people talked about the Okies, that was sort of derogatory. Then as the years went by, it's sort of a badge. So yeah, I'm an old Okie.
Many people of my generation were forever scarred by the Great Depression and World War II. But one vital instruction also comes out of those difficult years. After the crash, we were smart enough to pull together as a people and endure hard times. And after Pearl Harbor, we dropped our differences of race and class and religion to defeat our enemies. We felt connected to one another. Our individuality was not diminished by this feeling, but rather enhanced and made more significant. I wonder if it has to take a depression or a war to make us see this. Oh, and by the way, that store owned by the Kesslers from Queens, where my immigrant parents worked and lived in the back room and where I was born, my father went on not only to take over the business, but to buy the building. Just think of it, the building. Now that's the American dream. I'm Mario Cuomo.